led by the Usher of the Black Rod, Her Excellency the Right Honorable Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, and the Honorable Raymond Gagné, Speaker of the Senate. Guidé par l'UIC.
Guided by the Usher of the Black Rod, Her Excellency the Right Honorable Mary Simon, followed by the Honorable Raymond Gagné, Speaker of the Senate.
Please rise for the arrival of the official party.
Please rise for the arrival of the official party.
起立，总督阁下和参议院议长在黑杖示。
Please rise for the arrival of official party. Her Excellency the Right Honorable Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, and Honorable Raymond Gagné, Speaker of the Senate.
Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Please be seated.
Please be seated.
Your Excellency, the Right Honorable Governor General of Canada, Your Honorable Speaker of the Senate, Honorable Minister, Your Honor Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Votre Excellence, la gouverneure.
Your Excellency, the Right Honorable Governor General of Canada, Your Honorable Speaker of the Senate, Honorable Minister, Your Honor Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Your Excellency, the Right Honorable Governor General of Canada, Your Honorable Speaker of the Senate, Honorable Minister, Your Honor Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Whether you are here with us in the Senate chamber or watching from our live broadcasting, it is my great honor to welcome you on behalf of the organizing committee to this commemoration event marking the centenary of the passage of the Chinese Immigration Act, better known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. C'est un honneur.
It's an honor and a special occasion to get together today to reflect on a somber chapter of the Canadian history and to celebrate the rich heritage from the Canadian Chinese community.
I would like to, on behalf of the organizing committee, welcome everyone to this historical event.
Acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Ottawa community. J'aimerais commencer.
I'd like to state that we are located on the land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. We respect the connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people within the Ottawa community.
I would like to As early as the 1850s, the first generation of Chinese immigrants to Canada shed their blood and sweat and even gave their lives to build the Trans-Canada Pacific Highway,
which did not apply to any other immigrants. On July 1st, 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act, better known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, replaced the head taxes. This banned most forms of Chinese immigration into Canada and required those of Chinese descent already living in Canada, including the Canadian-born, to register with the government in order to stay in the country. La loi de l'exclusion.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was used for almost a quarter century. It separated families and inflicted pain for a long time in the Canadian Chinese community.
To May 1947, under pressure from the Canadian community, that the government finally repealed the Exclusion Act. Today, in 2023, we are here to recognize the devastating impacts of these discriminatory laws to the Chinese Canadian community. It is crucial for all of us to reflect on the generational psychological toll the community has endured. The act inflicted fear, suffering, and trauma. It separated families for decades and created a sense of exclusion and discrimination that have persisted to this day. 100年前的排华法案给
The Chinese Exclusion Act of a century ago caused immeasurable and indelible damage to the Chinese Canadian population. Not forgetting what happened before can help us learn from it afterwards. Today, we're collectively facing up to history and reflecting on it in order to prevent the recurrence of tragedies.
Justices are acknowledged, and where all individuals, regardless of their cultural heritage, can thrive and flourish. 让我们满怀自豪感和参与感，面向未来。
Let's face the future with pride and participation and work together to create an equal, inclusive, and diverse society.
共同努力，建設包容、平等、和諧的加拿大。多謝。
Thank you.
Welcome Her Honorable Senator Mary Jane McCallum to offer prayers and blessings to start us off in a good way. Veuillez accueillir l'honorable.
Please welcome Her Honorable Senator Mary Jane McCallum to offer prayers and blessings to start us off in a good way.
Please welcome Her Honorable Senator Mary Jane McCallum to offer prayers and blessings to start us off in a good way.
Thank you. I wear my shawl today. I wear it when I honor people, and we're honoring the Chinese community today. So I'm wearing this for you. Kitsimanitu, kinanas komitten, idum stay median, kitom igaskitayan, tawanskayan, tapagitatamuyan, igwastitawa pamago uwit niwak utagapi mamawapitsik. Piwitap minananuts, tapitawiyak, tawitiyak, magatakskidi tamak, kwesigaskitayak, tawichi suyak. Creator, thank you for the privilege of waking another day, for the miracle of another breath, for seeing the sky, earth, water, and to see the people that are gathered here today. Creator, come and sit with us today to hear us to help us as we navigate our way towards peace. Creator, you, in your power and wisdom, ensured that we are not all the same and never will be. That is both the beauty and strength of the human race. Getting to know other cultures and races allows us to see the web of life and to highlight each of our strengths. We know we choose our attitudes in any given set of circumstances. Settlers were welcomed into this land, and in turn, they dispossessed the indigenous peoples of these lands. They then proceeded to forbid some, and not others, from moving freely into this country, using race as a reason to exclude, thereby practicing race discrimination. Our humility today should allow us to say we can lift this oppression together, something we can begin to accomplish by respecting those who have been marginalized and recognizing their fundamental dignity. The First Nations and the Chinese share many things in common, some positive, some negative. Both understand the power and wisdom of the collective and the culture that goes with that. Both have ancestors that were determined and tenacious that their descendants would not continue to face obstacles, including oppression. Both have resilience and brilliance, allowing us to navigate our lives so as to become the people we were meant to be and not the limited version that nation state wanted us to believe. I have had the privilege to work with the Snuneymuxw First Nations in BC and heard the history of the close connection between the Chinese community and the First Nations. Of this relationship, Elder Joan Brown stated, "In my family research, I discovered one of my father's siblings that I didn't recognize. His name was Sam Wise. I asked my father, and he said, 'Oh, that is someone from the Chinese community. He had nowhere to go, so my grandparents adopted him.'" Elder Brown continued, "This to me always speaks of the way of the old people and the land, recognizing that we are all one family, regardless of age, gender, or ethnicity." Creator, give us the insight that as parliamentarians working through guidance from community, we are instruments of transformation towards peace. We have the ability to understand Canada's history and how the Chinese people were treated. We need to acknowledge this violent past of Canada. Knowing what we know now, how can we continue on the same path? We are capable of creating, sustaining, or destroying the patterns that determine the life course of oppressed peoples. When looking at what had enabled the history of Chinese exclusion, marginalization, and brutal violence, we can learn, improve, and put together a strategy on how to respectfully live together. Let our legacy be defined by our introspection to see what has brought us this far, the courage to decipher the truth, and to our resolve to do what is right. As a country, we need to change behaviors and thinking that no longer fit who we are becoming as diverse citizens of this great country that we all call home. To our Chinese grandfathers, grandmothers, brothers, and sisters, we hold you in our hearts, but on July 1st, we will hold you a little closer. Thank you.
非常感谢您的讲话。现在我邀请我们的第一位原住民总督 Mary Simon 发表讲话。
J'ai le privilège de donner la parole à son Excellence, la très
I have the privilege of giving the floor to the Right Honourable Mary Simon, the first Indigenous Governor-General of Canada.
讲话。
Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour. Dungasawiti ilunasi. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. 100 years ago, a law anchored in discrimination and intolerance came into effect. This was the Chinese Exclusion Act. We are gathered today to acknowledge the harm it caused to families, communities, and our country. Today, we add another chapter to Canada's true history in telling the stories of those who suffered as a result of racism. We are not rewriting the past, but giving a fuller picture of our history and our national narrative. It's about being inclusive. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour reconnaître.
We are gathered here to recognize the harm that this law caused to communities and to our country. Today, we add another chapter to Canada's true history.
By this act, it left a legacy of hurt and harm that takes time to repair. But I am here today to help in that process. And part of that is to acknowledge all that Chinese Canadians have done and still do for Canada. In short, they helped build this country. They contribute locally, nationally, and globally. They are innovative and passionate, and they are dedicated to public service, as exemplified by my predecessor, Adrienne Clarkson, who served as Governor General from 1999 to 2005. I know some watching this broadcast remember firsthand the impact the Chinese Exclusion Act had on their communities. I thank you for continuing to fight and to raise your voices against injustice and discrimination. What we do today is part of reconciliation. What we do is improving relationships between all Canadians in learning the truth of what happened and acknowledging the harm that was done. We make room for healing and for renewed relationships between Chinese Canadians and other Canadians. It is an ongoing process to deepen understanding between peoples. Many may not realize that the relationship between Indigenous peoples and those of Chinese descent is historically strong and long-standing. Chinese laborers built the railway and mines. Piece by piece, they helped build the infrastructure of this country, and Indigenous peoples supported them during this time, providing medicine and food. They helped each other. When the law prevented Chinese businesses or restaurants from serving white Canadians, Indigenous peoples frequented these places. And it was Chinese people who gave Indigenous people jobs when no one else would. These acts of kindness and support between communities of different backgrounds and beliefs are, I believe, the foundation of our modern Canada, a more inclusive Canada, a Canadian focused on reconciliation. We must remember this as Chinese Canadians face renewed discrimination and racism. History is there to teach us lessons, and we should reject sentiments and acts of racism and discrimination that we see today. Last week, the Canadian population hit 40 million. That is 40 million stories of hope, determination, pride, strength, struggle, renewal, challenge, and resilience. The story of Chinese Canadians is part of our overarching narrative, and it's a story more than a century in the making. They are an integral part of our country and a part of who we are. To everyone here in the Senate, to everyone watching across the country, let us all remember the mistakes of the past, learn from them, and let us build a more inclusive future together. Rappelons-nous les erreurs du passé pour bâtir.
Let's remember the mistakes of the past to build a more inclusive future together.
Miigwech nakumik.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your heartfelt message. I would now like to invite the Speaker of the Senate to the podium. Maintenant, je voudrais inviter la Présidente du Sénat.
I would like now to invite the Speaker of the Senate to the podium, the Honorable Raymond Gagné.
Raymond Gagné 女士讲话。
Son Excellence, Honorable Senators, distingués invités.
Distinguished guests.
Nous nous réunissons.
Today, we gather in the Senate to solemnly reflect on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. We recognized that our collective responsibility in charting Canada's path forward requires reflection on our past. Nearly a century ago, on July 1st, 1923, our federal government enacted a law that effectively barred Chinese citizens from entering Canada for a period of 24 years. This moment in our history serves as a stark reminder of our duty to uphold and protect the principles of equality and inclusivity, values that define the very essence of our nation.
23, otherwise known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, was introduced with the goal of curbing Chinese immigration to Canada. Prior to this act, discriminatory Chinese head taxes where Chinese citizens had to pay $50, $100, and then $500 to enter Canada had failed to slow Chinese immigration to Canada. During the legislative debates of that time, the federal government candidly acknowledged its goal of excluding Chinese citizens, in particular laborers, from entering Canada. Despite Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King's claim that the legislation would permit the entry of select groups of Chinese citizens, the enforcement of the act presented a very different reality. While official numbers are unknown, from 1923 to 1947, Canada admitted a mere 12 to a maximum of 50 Chinese immigrants.
The restrictive measures did not stop at the exclusion of Chinese citizens in Canada. Chinese citizens that were already here and that wanted to visit China could only go for 2 years, and those that would be gone for longer wouldn't be able to come back. The act also meant that Chinese people needed to be registered, even those that were born in Canada. Moreover, these people needed to carry photo identification certificates. Those that did not comply risked fines, detainment, or even deportation.
Dévalorisation.
The devaluation of Chinese immigrants was also apparent in a provision of the Act related to transportation. This provision mandated that vessels transporting Chinese immigrants to Canada carry just one individual for every 250 tons of the ship's weight, which essentially reduced Chinese citizens to mere cargo.
The lasting impact on the Chinese community in Canada was devastating. This act and the accompanying discrimination caused heart-wrenching consequences for families. The act led to prolonged and often permanent separation between loved ones. It left men who had immigrated to Canada for work unable to bring their wives and children to join them. This ultimately resulted in the emergence of a bachelor society. Chinese communities face marginalization and an increasing sense of isolation and alienation. Lorsque nous réfléchissons,
when we reflect on the impact of the Act, it is important to acknowledge efforts made to recognize our past mistakes. In 2006, the Canadian government formally apologized for the head tax, with Prime Minister Stephen Harper expressing his deepest sorrow for the subsequent exclusion of Chinese immigrants. Recently, on May 30th of this year, Parks Canada designated the exclusion of Chinese immigrants between 1923 and 1947 as a national historic event, further acknowledging that it is a difficult chapter of our history.
I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to my esteemed colleagues, Senator Wu and Senator Oh, whose relentless efforts continue to bring attention to the anniversary of the Act's implementation. I applaud their commitment to shining a light on this chapter of our history. Their dedication serves as a reminder of the ongoing work needed to understand and address the lasting impact of discriminatory policies. As both senators have noted in speeches to this chamber, this very building was constructed in 1912 by the Grand Trunk Railway. In a time prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act and before the implementation of the head taxes, when Canada was in dire need of their labor, thousands of Chinese men were recruited to assist in the construction of the western section of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Their work played a crucial role in unifying our country from east to west. It seems fitting, then, that we commemorate this moment here in what used to be the Union Station. I commend my honorable colleagues for the poignant exhibition that has been set up in what used to be the main concourse of the station. En conclusion, c'est en reconnaissant et en comprenant notre histoire, même les chapitres que nous regrettons.
In conclusion, by recognizing and understanding our history, even the chapters we regret, we can build an inclusive and equitable future. Mayor, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Speaker Gagné, for your remarks. I would now like to invite the Honorable Mary Ng, Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business and Economic Development, to the podium. J'aimerais inviter l'honorable discours. 有请加拿大国际贸
I would like to invite the Honorable Mary Wu, Minister of the International Trade, Export, Promotion, Small Business and Economic Development, to the podium.
Merci. Thank you. Good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. And let me begin by thanking the Senator and the Elder for starting us in a good way. And let me also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And for those of us who are settlers or even immigrants to Canada, it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples have always been here and have been the caretakers of this land, and that we all have a role to play in reconciliation. It's terrific to be in the Senate of Canada, of course, with you, Your Excellency, our Governor General, the Right Honourable Mary Simons, and we have many special guests here, so pardon me for just a moment to say my welcome. Of course, we have Ontario's Lieutenant Governor, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, who's here with us, senators who have done such a remarkable job at bringing your leadership to today's event. Thank you so much to both Senators Wu and O. And I also want to pay a particular hello to Dr. Vivian Poy, who I like to call Senator Emeritus. Because I want to thank Senator Poy for being a champion, for her leadership, and for her years and years of advocacy. And indeed, many of us today come to love and be fond of the month of May because we celebrate Asian Heritage Month, and it was during your leadership, Senator, that Asian Heritage Month came to be. And I have colleagues who are here, parliamentarians in MPs Jean Yip and Sean Chen and Wilson Miao, who are MPs of Chinese descent. So I wanted to welcome them, and of course all the parliamentarians, and certainly all the guests who are here, and of course Teresa Wu Pao of ACCT, which stands for Action Chinese Canadians Together, for your contribution in today's event. And for those who don't know, ACCT has brought their summit, their annual summit, to Ottawa. So welcome to Ottawa. It's terrific to have you. We are here today to mark the national official remembrance of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And 100 years ago, on July the 1st, in the House of Commons, where I and others serve, a new act was passed, a new law that called the Chinese Immigration Act, commonly known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was a law that specifically targeted one racialized group, the Chinese, from coming to Canada. And during the 24 years that it was in effect, fewer than 50 Chinese people officially immigrated to Canada. It barred people like me, and it certainly barred many people like those in this room from coming to Canada. The Exclusion Act not only prevented new Chinese immigrants from entering Canada, but it also reinforced the negative stereotypes and prejudices against the Chinese community. And as a result, Chinese Canadians faced immense discrimination and racism during this period. They were subjected to discriminatory laws, racial profiling, and social exclusion. But Chinese Canadians didn't accept this discriminatory treatment silently. They organized and launched significant advocacy to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was a long and arduous struggle that required both the unity and the resilience of the Chinese community. Enfin, in
1947, the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed. That was an important victory for the Chinese community in Canada.
It allowed for the reunification of Chinese families, but it also began to pave the way for greater Chinese immigration to Canada, and successive waves of many in this room, including my own family, was part of that immigration to Canada. Today, there are some 1.8 million Canadians of Chinese heritage who call Canada home. As we mark 100 years since the start of the Chinese Exclusion Act, let us pause and remember the countless and invaluable sacrifices of those Chinese Canadians who paved the way for us today. Today's event is an important one in our history. The Government of Canada has designated the exclusion of Chinese immigrants from 1923 to 1947 as a national historic event. We're also going to be revealing a plaque to mark the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act to recognize this national event. The plaque recognizes our history and those who fought hard for us to have a fair and more equitable Canada today. The plaque will be placed at the Chinese Canadian Museum in Vancouver, which is creating a critical repository for the Chinese Canadian experience that will document the art, the history, the heritage, while also celebrating the invaluable contributions of Chinese Canadians in creating the Canada of today. Just last month, I was at the museum. It's not quite open yet, but I was there to share that the Government of Canada was going to contribute $5 million to support this important historic site. And I'm going to be there on June the 30th to open up this museum on the eve of 100 years ago when this law was passed. It's important to educate and to share with Canadians the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And here, the Government of Canada is providing $100,000 to ACCT for the remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act to ensure that the event is marked with the respect that it deserves and to educate Canadians not only on this sad history, but also the impact of this law and also on the invaluable contributions that are made by Chinese Canadians to our great country. Our government will also contribute $50,000 to ACCT to advance Chinese Canadian civic engagement and their leadership so that more people can take up positions of leadership. It builds on the government's important investments for the Chinatown Storytelling Centre in Vancouver and investments of nearly $2 million to revitalize the Vancouver Chinatown, as well as an investment of $600,000 for the Winnipeg Chinese Cultural Centre to upgrade those spaces so that we can ensure that we preserve the stories in that wonderful place for the future, as well as a contribution of more than $2.3 million to the Chinese Cultural Centre of Greater Toronto. And finally, to fight anti-Asian racism and racism of all of its forms, the federal government has contributed $11 million specifically so that we can tackle anti-Asian racism and racism, taking a whole-of-government approach to fighting racism in all of its forms. There is still much to do to continue to break down the barriers and to create a more inclusive society. But this year, it's more timely than ever to recognize our history and to ensure that it never repeats itself again. Des événements comme celui d'aujourd'hui.
Events like today are very important.
Respect to the legacy of Chinese Canadians, both past and present. Today, we are proud Chinese Canadians, and we contribute to every aspect of Canadian life, from business to arts and culture, to sports and science, to teachers, to frontline healthcare workers, to the professions. I see so many of you in this gallery here today, but also to political life, dare I say. I know that there are many Canadians in this room who are going to keep this 100 years of history alive, to tell the story of today and to tell it to tomorrow's generation. I know I'm going to, and use the podium that I have as a federal member of parliament and as a cabinet minister, along with my colleagues and all of you, to do that. Alors, travaillons ensemble. I look forward.
Let's work together.
To officially unveil the plaque at the Chinese Canadian Museum, where it will live. Together, let's keep preserving our history, celebrating our Chinese culture as Canadians, and let's stand together to support the generations to come. We have much to be proud and we have much work to do. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Ng. Now I would like to invite Her Excellency Mary Simon, Honorable Raymond Gagné, Minister Ng, Ms. Teresa Wu Pao, Dr. Alway, Chair of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, Professor Lloyd Wong, and Ms. Nadine Spence, Vice President of Parks Canada, to the front for the plaque unveiling. 请大家把目光集中在这里，让我
Please focus your attention. Please focus your attention here and let us witness the solemn and sacred moment in history as the plaque commemorating the centennial of the Chinese Exclusion Act is about to unveil.
The plaque reads, on July 1st, 1923, Canada prohibited Chinese immigration. The Chinese Immigration Act 1923, Chinese Exclusion Act, was the culmination of anti-Chinese racism and policies, including the head taxes which it replaced. All Chinese persons living in Canada, even those born here, had to register with the government or risk deportation, fines, or imprisonment. The act impeded family reunification, community development, social integration, and economic equality. Chinese men and women and their allies challenged this racist law, leading to its repeal in 1947. Still, their fight to dismantle racist immigration restrictions continued. Le 1er juillet 1923.
On July 1st, 1923, Canada prohibited Chinese immigration. The Chinese Immigration Act 1923, Chinese Exclusion Act, was the culmination of anti-Chinese racism and policies, including the head taxes which it replaced. All Chinese persons living in Canada, even those born here, had to register with the government or risk deportation, fines, or imprisonment. The act impeded family reunification, community development, social integration, and economic equality. Chinese men and women and their allies challenged this racist law, leading to its repeal in 1947. Still, their fight to dismantle racist immigration restrictions continued.
On the 1st of July 1923, Canada prohibited Chinese immigration. The Chinese Immigration Act 1923, otherwise known as Chinese Exclusion Act, was the culmination of the anti-Chinese racism and policies, including the head taxes, which it repealed. All Chinese persons living in Canada, even those born here, had to register with the government or risk deportation, fines, or imprisonment. The act impeded family reunification, community development, social integration, and economic equality. Chinese men and women and their allies challenged this racist law, leading to its 1947 repeal. Still, their fight to dismantle racist immigration restrictions continued.
Dr. Olway to the podium. J'aimerais inviter Dr. Olway.
I would now like to invite Dr. Olway, who is the chairman of the Historic.
I would like to invite Mr. Dr. Olway, chair of the Historical Sites and Monuments Board of Canada.
Your Excellency, Madam Speaker, Minister, Your Honor, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen of the streaming audience from coast to coast. Mesdames et Messieurs, le passé du Canada.
Ladies and gentlemen, Canada's past is rich in characters and events of all kinds that have made our country what it is. As Canadians, our knowledge of this past, its successes and failures, enriches our understanding of the world in which we live.
What we are doing this afternoon is, I think, very important to all of us as Canadians, to us as a people. Our own history and how we remember our past is important because it helps define the way we think of ourselves as a society. The straight fact is that history is to the nation as memory is to the individual. It gives meaning and context and identity. Without it, we simply can't know ourselves. But using it as a common foundation, we can perhaps together build a future bright with possibility. I'm asked to take just a moment to explain the work of the board to you. Created in 1919 and composed of representatives of all provinces and territories, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada advises the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change and Minister responsible for Parks Canada on the commemoration of nationally significant aspects of Canada's past. As a board, our agenda is in large part driven by public and interest and concerns as we respond to requests that people, places, or events be declared of national historic significance. So for over a century then, the installation of the familiar gold and maroon bronze plaques has been a cornerstone of the federal government's effort to formally commemorate those parts of Canadian history which have been recognized as having pan-Canadian or national importance. And over this period, around 2,000 plaques have been erected. This afternoon, we add to that number by recognizing the exclusion of Chinese immigrants 1923 to 1947 as an event of national historic significance, and through this ceremony, today, in the Senate of Canada, we draw this story to the attention of all Canadians. History, we know, is complex, and historical commemoration must be more than simply celebration in order to reflect the full reality of our national story. Designations can recall moments of greatness and triumph, but they can also help us to reflect on the more difficult moments of our collective past. The exclusion of Chinese immigrants after the passage of the 1923 Act represents one of the most negative and tragic chapters in Canadian history. It must not be forgotten, still less ignored. The clear intention of the legislation was to end Chinese immigration to Canada. And for 24 years, it succeeded. But through the continuing efforts of courageous and committed activists like Juan Alexander Cumio, Q. Doc Yip, and Jean Lum, and many others, in 1947, the Act was repealed. And when we think about it, we can see that Canada in 1947 was not the same country it had been in 1923 when the Act was passed. And the Canada in 2023 is not the same country it was in 1947. Canada changes. The country grows and evolves, and so too does our national story, as represented by our history. I would suggest that over the decades, the moral arc of this nation bends toward acceptance and equity and inclusion. They become fundamental values. Canada this past week has just celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day. June is identified in many communities across the country as Pride Month. I ask you, could either of those things have happened without first the successful fight culminating in the repeal in 1947 of the Chinese Exclusion Act? No, progress is not always linear. There can be pauses and diversions, but the direction is set, and it is constant. What we do this afternoon is to formally recognize a Canadian failure and a profound injustice. I think when we reflect, we can perhaps also do this within a broad context of growing hope for our collective future based on the record provided by the history of the past 8 decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alway. Next, I would like to introduce our first performance of the day. Please welcome the Go Ballet dancers performing Pathways to the Future. 请欣赏芭蕾舞表演《通向未来之路》。Veuillez accueillir.
Next, I would like to introduce our first performance of the day. Please welcome the Go Ballet dancers performing Pathways to the Future.
Your Honor, honorable senators, members of parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends, 尊敬的总督阁下，尊敬的贵宾
Distinguished guests, Your Excellency, Your Honor.
Gathered here in the Senate chamber, which is on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin, are Canadians who have come from across the country to take part in today's event. Gathered on the traditional lands of many other Indigenous peoples are thousands more who are watching this ceremony via live stream. From the Pier 21 Museum in Halifax to the Toronto and Calgary Public Libraries to the University of British Columbia, Canadians are taking part virtually in this truly national event at one of nearly 400 registered viewing parties. To all of you who are watching online, I want to say that your presence is felt in this chamber, and all of us here in Ottawa thank you for being part of this historic commemoration. We are so fortunate to have Go Ballet kick off today's event with their original dance, Pathways to the Future, which was specially choreographed for this occasion. You will have noticed that the dancers bowed a few times at the end of their performance. This was not only to acknowledge your appreciation, but it was also an artistic rendition of the ritual bowing that many Chinese observe when they remember and honor their ancestors. Which is why we are here today, on the 100th anniversary of the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This ceremony, like so many other events that are taking place across Canada in 2023, is not only about a 100-year-old law, it is above all about the Chinese in Canada who paid the price of that vile legislation and the trauma that inflicted the Chinese community for years to follow. You will see the faces of some of the ancestors we honor today in the exhibition on display in the concourse of the Senate of Canada building, where we will be holding a reception after this ceremony. And when you have finished looking at the portraits of Chinese men, women, and children who were subject to the head tax and other compulsory registration schemes, I invite you to then study the documents also on display in the Senate concourse, which record how the Parliament of Canada went about making the Chinese Exclusion Act possible. The speeches given in support of the Act are difficult to read, especially for me, since I am a senator from British Columbia. After all, it was senators from BC 100 years ago who argued the most ardently for Chinese exclusion. For what it is worth, the Senate of Canada made the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923 less harmful than it could have been. The upper house removed the requirement for a language test to apply to Chinese already in Canada that the House of Commons had passed. That provision if kept, would have likely led to the mass deportation of Chinese who were deemed to be not sufficiently fluent in English. Perhaps the thought of having to find a way of transporting thousands of Chinese across the Pacific was the impulse behind this outburst of sober second thought. But it was in any event a slim lining of silver in an otherwise dark and ominous cloud that lingered over the Chinese for 24 years. The harm caused by the Exclusion Act on Chinese in Canada and on the generations to follow cannot be overstated. You will hear as much in the protest song, Never Forget July 1st, 无忘弃妖, written 100 years ago, which will be sung later in our program. But it is a measure of the courage and resilience of those who were ensnared by the act that the Chinese community did not abandon hope, shrivel up, and wither away. On the contrary, the community campaigned for the repeal of the act through words and deeds and were finally rewarded in 1947. The first Chinese Canadian to cast a vote was Wan Kam Yao, Wen Jingyou, who, though trained as a lawyer, was prohibited from being called to the bar because he was Chinese. He paved the way for others to join the legal profession, including, in 1946, the first Chinese woman to be called to the Canadian bar. Greta Wong, at the ripe young age of 102, is, I hope, watching today's ceremony by live stream. And she is perhaps the only person attending our event who lived through the entire period of Chinese exclusion. There are times, though, when I wonder the period of Chinese exclusion really is over. The recent sharp increase in racist acts against Chinese and other Asian Canadians should give us all pause, especially those of us who are the usual occupants of the seats in this chamber. The Senate, together with the House of Commons, got it very, very wrong 100 years ago, and it would be hubris to think that we couldn't get it wrong again. This ceremony, therefore, is fundamentally about looking ahead and looking out for the danger signs of contemporary exclusion against all modern targets of Canadian society. Chinese Canadians have always sought to fight exclusion by embracing ever more closely the country that sought to exclude them. They did so by building a railroad that they could have not expected to benefit from. They did so by volunteering to fight for a country that did not recognize them as citizens. They did so by excelling in the trades and professions that make Canada successful, even when they were barred from full participation in these roles. And they did so by giving back to society through good works, even when their good works were not given equal recognition or were looked upon with suspicion. And they continue to do so today. You, all of you, continue to do so today. There are innumerable examples of how Chinese Canadians have embraced ever more tightly this country, Canada, as an antidote to the historical exclusion that their forebears faced, and of how they achieved spectacular success in all professions and callings. Our next speaker is one such example. It would be shorthand to say that he is a Chinese-Canadian business success story, but that would only be a shorthand because he represents so much more than business success. I'm going to let him tell us his story. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium the President and CEO of H.Y. Louis Limited and the Chairman of London Drugs, Dr. Brant Louis.
Your Excellency, Madam Speaker, Ministers, Honorable Senators, and distinguished guests. I'm very grateful to Senator Wu and to all of you for the opportunity to speak today. I am here today to tell you a story. It is the story of the Chinese who came to this country to seek a better life, just as all immigrants do. It began before this country was formed, and it continues to this very moment. My family story reflects the same journey thousands of Chinese have taken since arriving in Canada in the late 1700s. It is my privilege to be here today to acknowledge those people and to remember. Just as we do for anniversaries of other more somber occasions, we gather for reflection. We also gather bringing our collective experience so we can look forward together. I live by the idea that we forgive, but should never forget. That means moving beyond blame and rhetoric and finding new ways to think and act. We serve past generations and our history best when we heed their lessons. That is why it is important we have this national remembrance of the Exclusion Act of 1923. It was Winston Churchill who said, "The longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward." It may be hard for most Canadians to look back at 1923 and understand what might have warranted the Exclusion Act to be passed into law. In fact, we must look back. We look further back for the genesis of what would become one of the most harsh and discriminatory acts in our history. The seeds were planted in the need for labor to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. Once the project was complete, there was no need for the influx of Chinese who had been brought in. The Immigration Act of 1885 came into being along with the head tax. The act was modeled after similar laws in the U.S. and other countries. They were designed to discourage the Chinese from coming to those countries, as was the case here in Canada. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 stopped Chinese immigration to this country for almost 25 years. It also effectively stranded thousands of men here, unable to return home, bring their families here, or to find a wife. What must never be overlooked is the loss of potential. We have no way of knowing what impact those unborn generations may have had on Canadian society. Like many Chinese Canadians living here today, the history of my family in Canada predates Confederation. My maternal great-grandfather, Sito Fanjing, arrived in Victoria in 1862. His son, Sito Yingshek, was born in Victoria in 1889. Better known as Sito Moore, he was considered a great intellectual, artist, and scholar. He was held in high regard by many in the political, scientific, and cultural communities. Interestingly, he has a direct link to today's proceedings. Well known in the community, he headed a committee to study the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. They came up with 4 proposals to oppose the harsher elements of the new law. During this time, he also acted as a liaison between the Chinese Council and the local Chinese Canadian community. As we know, the act eventually did pass into law. However, Sito Moore helped to reduce the outright exclusion of all Chinese, first proposed by the Canadian lawmakers. My paternal grandfather, Hokyat Louis, immigrated to Canada in 1898. On arrival, as noted in his Chinese immigration certificate, he paid the $50 head tax. In 1903, 20 years before the Exclusion Act, he formed the H.Y. Louis Company, a family business and one of British Columbia's largest employers, still in operation 120 years later. Along with his Chinatown neighbors, he survived the race riots of 1907 and ongoing systemic racism to succeed and thrive As I stated earlier, the story of my ancestors is a story of countless Chinese in Canada. Despite efforts to deny them their rights and freedoms and human dignity, they had the courage to persevere and overcome their circumstances. Their story is Canada's story. And if we wish to say we are truly inclusive and a diverse country, everyone must be included. It is critical the story of the Chinese Canadians, like those of Indigenous people, be told fully and truthfully. Acknowledging the full history and contribution of the Chinese in Canada with events like today is a good step forward. We must also take care to embed it in our educational system to ensure the lessons learned last well into the future. I believe the greatest privilege and responsibility we have as leaders is to pave the way for the next generation. We owe at least that to those that came to this country in pursuit of their dreams and to seek a new life. It is incumbent on us to ensure those dreams are fulfilled. They are no longer on us to ensure those dreams are fulfilled. They are no longer with us, but their stories remain. Their lives matter, and what they worked for is the fuel that should drive future generations. Those dreams that may have seemed so distant are in fact reality for young Chinese Canadians today. However, they are not without challenges. It is widely believed that this younger generation experienced less discrimination, being born more distant from the time of the Exclusion Act. In fact, what we saw in 2020 was a reemergence of racism that had always survived just under the surface. One of the recurring themes of racist remarks aimed at the Chinese Canadians during the last 3 years has been, "Go home, go back to where you came from." That remark harkens directly back to 1923. It reflects a time many thought was in the past. It also reminds us that we must be vigilant in protecting how far we've come. As we've seen with some of our closest neighbors, rights and freedoms, long thought permanent, are being eroded and repealed. Facing enormous adversity often brings out the best in a community and a nation. Sadly, the worst can also emerge as we witness in the dramatic rise of racism over the course of the pandemic. Critical to Canada's future, it may have acted as a deterrent to young Chinese to follow a path to public office or seek leadership in business and the community. The myth of the so-called model minority still exists and has perhaps been exacerbated by events of the last few years. Encouraging young people to step forward should be encouraged in any way we can and with all the resources we can muster. The story of the Chinese who came to this country to seek a better life began before this country was formed, and it continues to this very moment. I believe a community and a nation is created by the stories it tells about itself. For too long, many of our stories have been untold, ignored, or overlooked. I believe it is vital to our future that we understand our past. We create that understanding only when we acknowledge our entire history. It is important that all Canadians are educated on all aspects of Canada's history, even the parts that are darker. By acknowledging the events of 1923, we shine a light on the challenges, sacrifices, and the extraordinary contributions of generations of Chinese Canadians. I remain optimistic we can find ways to move forward positively, to build the kind of future all Canadians are promised. To accomplish that, we must be informed by our history, but not defined by it. As a nation, we have long prided ourselves on our commitment to multiculturalism and inclusion. However, recent events tells us we still have a long way to go. If you will allow a metaphor, Canada is akin to becoming the owner of an old house. We didn't build it, but as the current owners, we have the responsibility to fix what is needed. Canada's reputation has been that of a peacemaker, a country of inclusion. Some say a mosaic, but a mosaic only reveals its true beauty when it is seen as a whole. The possibilities exist for us to reimagine a Canada that includes all histories and all peoples equally. There is a famous saying that tells us, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. We must have courage. We must continue. Our future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wu. Thank you, Dr. Louis. I would now like to invite former Senator Vivienne Poy to the podium. J'aimerais inviter l'ancienne sénatrice Dr.
I would like now to invite former Senator Vivienne.
I would like to invite former Senator Vivienne Poy to the podium. She was the first female senator of Chinese background in the Canadian Senate. Thank you.
Your Excellency, Your Honor, Honorable Senators, Minister, and friends. It is indeed a pleasure to be speaking in this chamber again after having been absent for 12 years. 100 years ago, the Dominion government did their utmost in exterminating our Indigenous cultures and severely discriminated against anyone who didn't look European. In 1923, the Act Respecting Chinese Immigration, as was mentioned before, also known as Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically targeted one ethnic group. Now, that was very, very unusual, the Chinese. And it was adopted and assented in this chamber, despite the fact that it was Chinese labor that had made it possible for the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway through the Rockies in order to connect British Columbia to the rest of Canada. Otherwise, British Columbia would have become a part of the United States. Besides exclusion, the 1922 Act also required every person of Chinese origin or descent in Canada, irrespective of allegiance or citizenship, to register and obtain a certificate to show that they have entered Canada legally. I want to mention at this time that my husband's family, the Poy family, including our former Governor General, Adrian Clarkson, who was Adrian Poy, were on this registry. Now, the family were in Canada temporarily during the Second World War. And in 1947, if the Chinese exclusion had not been repealed, the Poy family would have been deported from Canada. A more humane Canada began after Canadian soldiers had fought Nazism, fascism, and Japanese imperialism in the Second World War. Canada started to accept refugees from Eastern Europe. Chinese exclusion was repealed, and in 1948, Canadian John Peters Humphrey drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was unanimously adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. This was the Canada I knew when I came to study at McGill University in 1959. Over the next half-century, laws and regulations began to gradually reflect a more just society. And in order to adapt to labor needs, Canadian immigration slowly opened to populations globally. Today, Canada is a very different country from what it was 100 years ago, as Dr. Alway had mentioned. As an immigrant-welcoming country since 1967, it is knowledge and skills that are the requirements for immigration and no longer the color of our skins. In order for our country to prosper and be a leader among nations, Your Excellency, Your Honor, Minister, Honorable Senators, what happened 100 years ago to the Chinese must never be allowed to happen again to any group in Canada.
Dr. Louis Mendes, Senator Poi, thank you for your touching words. It is a privilege to have you both joining us for today's ceremony. Your Excellency, Mary Simpson, Your Honorable Elizabeth Dowley, colleagues, senators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, 今天我谨代表
I, on behalf of Canadian Parliament, I would like to extend my welcome to all brothers and sisters of Chinese background and to reflect this despicable act that was passed 100 years ago. Today, we would like to advocate for our effort in order to protect our rule of law and to build a more prosperous Canada.
As an ethnic Chinese senator for Ontario, it is the honor of a lifetime to speak to you on this remarkable day of remembrance. Today, we commemorate the centennial anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the very chamber that approved the legislation 100 years ago, the provisions of the Chinese Exclusion Act is not lost on the minds of our guests, both in person and virtual. Among us, we have direct descendants of head tax certificate holders, Canadians whose very existence was threatened by the exclusionary nature of the Act. Neither effects of this law affects our community even to this day. For its perpetuated system inequality that prevented Chinese Canadians from proposing with the educational and professional opportunity of other Canadians. Nevertheless, as I gaze up upon the Red Chamber today, I see resilience, determination, and above all, I see hope. Through our strength and grief, we steadily dismantled and overcame many of the system hurdles set against us. Please look around this chamber. You will find Chinese Canadian parliamentarians, public servants, academics, and business people. Successful Canadians at the top of their field, rightfully recognized from coast to coast to coast. I see hope because we are joined by fellow members of the Chinese Canadian community. On this momentous occasion, to reflect upon the sacrifices and celebrate the success of our communities. We have come far, my friend, and how bright and our future continues to shine. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to the upcoming performance of the song Never Forget July 1st. The song, whose author is unknown, was written as part of protest songwriting contest, organized around the time of the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act. For today's ceremony, we will have the honor to listen to the song with a brand new score composed by the Winnipeg-based composer Ashley Au and performed by a choir assembly under the direction of Mr. Chin Ki Yang, especially for this occasion. Tomorrow, June 24, I invite all of you to join me to attend a peaceful rally organized by the Ottawa Chinese community to mark the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act at the Parliament Hill, just a walking distance from here. And I hope you will enjoy today's show. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. 谢谢. McCrick.
Thank you, Senator O. Next up, please welcome our National Remembrance Ceremony Choir. La chorale va maintenant chanter N'oublions jamais.
The choir will now sing.
Please welcome our National Remembrance Ceremony Choir, bringing a song called Do Not Forget July 1st.
For The Chinese Exclusion Act, otherwise known as the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, was passed by this Parliament of Canada and came into force 100 years ago, as many of our speakers had referenced. It was aimed deliberately and specifically at a race of peoples, and as these peoples, our ancestors, where we see its impacts. Your Excellency, Your Honor, honorable senators, distinguished guests, and perhaps most importantly, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, uncles, aunties, cousins, grandparents, friends, who have all gathered in this august chamber, and the thousands of those who have gathered to watch these proceedings in communities and in their homes across Canada. My name is Albert Wong Ka Sing. Good afternoon. That was the first time I ever used my Chinese name in Canada. In commemorating the centenary of this act, we need to turn our focus on individuals who, like us, were simply seeking a better life for themselves and, more importantly, for their family. It is in their stories where we find pain and sorrow, and where we also find determination and perseverance. My stories today that I'm going to recount begin with Wong Alexander Kum Yao, who Senator Wu mentioned, who in March 1861 was the first Chinese Canadian born in British North America. His parents immigrated to these lands. Educated here, he spoke multiple languages: Hakka, Cantonese, English, and Chinook Wawa. He completed his education and trained in law, as Senator Wu mentioned. He was unable to take the bar exam and become a lawyer, as he was not on the voters list. Despite being born here, the denial of his voting rights, a basic tenet of citizenship, resulted in a denial of a professional career in law. He applied to become a notary in 1903, but this too was denied, as he was unable to vote. He was an activist for Chinese Canadians' rights for most of his life. His son, Gordon, also studied law, the first Chinese Canadian to study law at UBC. Voting rights was finally restored for Chinese Canadians in 1947, as was mentioned, and Mr. Kum Yao was able to cast his vote for the first time in 1949 federal election at the ripe young age of 88. My second story involves a young teenage girl born in Hong Kong who came to Canada with her parents in the 70s, fulfilling the dreams of a maternal grandfather. Their arrival in Calgary 50 years ago marked the first family reunion of her maternal family and the first meeting of her father, who was then in his 40s, with her paternal grandfather, who was in his 60s. The fulfillment of two family milestones since the first arrival of her great-grandfathers to North America as laborers in the 1920s. That teenager graduated from the University of Calgary in 1982 with a Bachelor of Social Works, and became a community activist with years serving all peoples. Along the way, she founded 6 volunteer organizations and was elected a public school board trustee in Calgary in 1995. You can't cry, Teresa. You're going to make me cry. The first Chinese woman to hold such a position. She was later elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in 2008. Again, the first Chinese woman to hold that position, and became a cabinet minister and a member of the Executive Council of Alberta. Yes, the first Chinese woman to do so. That teenager who came to Canada and saw her grandparents for the first time in the 70s is our Teresa Wu Pao. And she's now the chair of ACCT Foundation and the chair of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Thank you, Teresa. My final story I will tell you today is that of a man whose story almost never started. Well known in the Chinese Canadian community here in Ottawa, Mr. Bill Zhou, standing over here. Well known in the Chinese Canadian community here in Ottawa, Mr. Bill Zhou has poured his energy, his compassion, and his resources to helping others gain a foothold in this community. His father, Shang Zhou, first arrived in Ottawa sometime between 1915 and 1916. He opened Zhou's Laundry and Cleaners at Slater Street. In 1919, he went back to China and married Kai Wen Zhang. However, they could not afford her passage to Canada at that time, and so the husband returned to Canada to earn sufficient money to pay for his wife's passage. This finally happened, and Mrs. Zhou was on a ship bound for Canada in 1923. She was caught by the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was implemented while she was at sea. And as she arrived, it was only through the intervention of a church and members of the church that she was allowed to land and join her husband, becoming one of the last to pay the head tax. Bill was born in 1929. He's a giant in the Ottawa Chinese Canadian community, co-founding the Ottawa Chinese Community Service Center, the Ottawa Restaurant Association, and the Kiwanis Club of Rideau. He got involved with Project 4000, sat on 2 committees, and the planning board, and was director of the Board of Trade for Ottawa. He raised hundreds of thousands for Chinese senior residents on Florence Street and a special floor for Chinese seniors in the Glebe Center. And when you go along Somerset Street, you will see the magnificent Chinatown Arch. Bend down and look at the stone base, and you will see Bill and June Zhou's name printed on as the top-tier donor for this project. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bill Zhou. The Chinese Exclusion Act was crafted and passed by this Parliament of Canada 100 years ago, and it was repealed 24 years later. And it was repealed as caused in large measure by the resilience of those who were the very target of this act. Their resilience and their determination to build a life on these native lands ensured our future. By not giving up, by not going away, their determination, their perseverance, and indeed their loyalty secured our citizenship today. And our citizenship, our belonging, benefits all peoples on this land. I now invite our spoken word artist to share his performance with us, Mr. Christopher C. Chris.
What do I have to do to be accepted? I'm always looking in from the outside. Jean Lum, Order of Canada. I still remember wet, hot Quebecois summers, wandering the kitchen of Gong Gong's restaurant, tracing my finger on stainless steel countertops, sliding my feet on slick tile floors, a child, dodging the frenzied bodies of distant relatives, all of them my great-uncles, all of them Toisanese, shouting at each other in slurred village dialects of the Heung Ha, small men with big wok hei, slinging fried rice and chicken balls with fierce abandon. Outside, a dining room of people wait impatiently for their lunch specials. Désolé, quelques minutes de plus, my grandpa repeats in broken French over and over, his smile tired bright, his eyes a disappearing horizon, always searching east, always pointed home. Did he know that coming to Canada would turn out this way? That he would live out the rest of his days scraping by, serving his culture deep-fried and assimilated. Gong Gong's restaurant was called Les Rivières Orientales, a tributary of an oriental river flowing across the Pacific, of coolies and laborers, yellow peril and cheap slaves from motherland to stolen land, bent backs and burnt hands to build railway and nation, economic immigration. We pledge allegiance to the Confederation that advocates our deportation, isolation, dislocation, subjugation, denigration. See, we were never supposed to be here. We were never supposed to become doctors and engineers. We were never meant to make home from the ashes, to make kin from the masses. We know that when the Chinaman comes here, he intends to return to his own country. He does not bring his family with him. He is a stranger, a sojourner in a strange land. He has no common interest with us. John A. MacDonald. When my great-great-grandfather landed in 1880, I wonder if he could read the signs posted on street corners that said no Chinese or dogs allowed. Or did these foreign scribbles amuse him, inspire him in his struggle? All of our elders in their journey to the West, what pain did they endure? What shame remained obscured? What names did they take to survive? When Stephen Harper apologized to head tax survivors, there was no refund for those who could never afford it. What is the cost for countless families split down the middle like steamed pork buns? Family trees pruned far too soon. What reparations for the lonely only caught between generations, a Western creature with Eastern features, forever a foreigner, a sojourner in a strange land? Is there a credit for this rootlessness? Can I invoice for that dissonance? They called us the paper children, and how apt. Our identities so fraught, so fragile, so as to collapse, fly away on the wind, big guest energy. See, we have been here long enough to realize that we can never be here long enough. Our mother tongues will always be too foreign, our food too pungent, our ambition too overzealous. There will always be someone older stock. And if a Chinaman dies in a railway tunnel and a CPR foreman isn't around to record it, does he make a sound? Does the ground open up to welcome him? Our ancestors lie tucked away in rockfall deposits. Their skeletons are the skeletons in democracy's closet. Can you hear them? Can you see us now? They say we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. But what of our ancestors' nightmares? It's been 100 years since you legislated our discrimination. What has changed? Third, fourth, fifth generation still estranged. Our elders go to their deathbed still ashamed. Our young ones born in this country still constrained, still told to go home, still spit on at bus stops, still virus, still spies, still foreign interference. We have never been allowed people. But today we stand and we scream for every face that looks like me, every kid who's ever pulled their nose bridge to make it taller, every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender, for our full names, past and present. May they be pronounced and may they be respected, for every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land, every small town jade garden and dragon cafe, every gentrified Chinatown and rusty railway. We are here. We have been here far longer than the past 100 years. So child, when they tell you to go back where you come from, tell them you come from elbow grease and laundry bleach, from broken English and MSG. hunchback elders and paper sons, you come from a history of resistance, backbones and persistence, resilience and commitment. Tell them you belong. Tell them we belong. Show them your hands. These are the same blistered fingers that once clutched railway hammers, that form fists and family alongside our native relations. Feet bound by tradition, but forever forging forwards in lockstep recognition that freedom comes towards us in 100 years. Let us not look back again and mark what's left undone, but instead how far we've come, the fights we have won, and the sum of our people standing proud and equal. The past is the past, let this be the sequel. No longer ashamed and no longer illegal, but proud, unrelenting, and home.
I thought being the last speaker would be easy. Your Excellency, Your Honor, Minister Ng, Honorable Senators, fellow Canadians, community members, and friends, 大家好. It is indeed my honor to address you this afternoon on behalf of the Action Chinese Canadian Together Foundation, right here in the capital of Canada, in the chamber of the Senate, House of the Sober Second Thought, where the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed and enacted on July 1st, 1923, for almost a quarter century, representing a darker chapter of Canadian history. Today's national remembrance of the centenary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, hosted by the Senate of Canada, we turned the page, starting with the recognition by the Government of Canada, Historical Sites and Monument Board of Canada, that the Chinese Exclusion Act is of national historic significance to Canada, recognizing both the historical importance of the Act and the social consequences of the Act that impacted the people and development of Canada. Today is historic that we have a gathering of a diversity of people, including many of Chinese descent, that did not have a voice in this very chamber until about 2 decades ago, when the Honorable Vivian Poy was appointed as the first Canadian senator of Asian descent. We have Mr. Zhou. We have Mr. Zhou, a living member from the Exclusion Act era, representing the immense resilience of the community. Mr. Brand Louis, representing the Louis family that have served and supported Canadians for 7 generations. Minister, senators, trailblazer senior public servants, community leaders, educators, artists, human services and human profession and leaders. Representative from Canadian military and justice, businesses and entrepreneurs, students and activists from across Canada, remembering our collective past and telling our Canadian stories. I would also like to share a poem, not written by me, that resonated with me, that I believe will resonate with some of the other people observing today's event, written by a younger friend of mine. I consider him representing my children's generation, whom I met recently working on a Canada Day project that we have entitled Essential Canadians. And it goes, my great-grandparents built the railroad that connected and founded Canada. My grandparents ran the laundromats and restaurants that served towns all across the country. My parents started the shops and businesses that became part of the cultural and economic richness of our greatest cities. Now, like my parents' parents, and even their parents before them, I work for Canada.
I look after your kids. I take care of your parents. I make sure you're healthy. I plant and harvest your food. I stock your shelves. I deliver your goods. I build your homes. I educate your sons and daughters. I run business big and small in your communities. I add to the vibrancy and cultural richness of your cities. I'm more than an essential worker. I'm an essential Canadian. I work for Canada. Canada doesn't work without me. We want you to join us to work, to serve, and to build an even greater Canada for our kids and our kids' kids, so that they will become even more essential Canadians who will pioneer, innovate, create, and lead us all to a brighter tomorrow. The Action Chinese Canadian Together Foundation, we earnestly start the next chapter tomorrow, right here at the capital of Canada, at the Aspire to Lead Leaders Summit, to contemplate what we want for the next 100 years. We will examine issues of persistent underrepresentation of Chinese Canadian in leadership, our role in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and working with other equity-seeking groups as leaders. We will explore what would a truly equitable and inclusive Canada look like for ourselves and our children. And as my good colleague and arts champion, Patty Pond, reminds of us, what is Canada asking of us at this moment in time? I would like to thank the Senate for hosting and the Senators' active participation and contribution in the programming of the Remembrance event today. All the staff and volunteers from the Senators' offices and the ACT Foundation. Chair of our Remembrance event committee, Judge Albert Wong, and the Government of Canada, Canadian Heritage, for supporting the public education of the Chinese exclusion in the months to come. And the amazing performances by our commissioned artists, Chan Han Go of British Columbia, and the Go Ballet dancers for the elegant and moving portrayal of the Exclusion Act, the Chinese-Canadian composer Ashley Au from Manitoba, and the choir from Ontario, for encapsulating the sentiment of our forefathers who endured the exclusion and humiliation, separations and loneliness, but also the enduring hope and determination. Your efforts made possible to include the voices of our ancestors who paved the ways for us in the Remembrance today. And Chris Tees, my little contribution for bringing you here. So from Yukon Territory, your poignant words reminds us of our continuing quest for full and equal citizenship, the optimism and hope of our future generations, and a generation that is finding their voices to take up their space and to continue our Canadian stories. We thank the many public entities, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, Pier 21 Museum, the municipalities from coast to coast, including Halifax, Calgary, Alberta, and several municipalities from the Greater Toronto Area, as well as the many community organizations and individuals that are part of the almost 500 watch parties hosts from across the country today. We thank you for your participation and support. Thank you all for partaking in today's remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act and your steadfast support during this yet another challenging time for Canadians of Chinese descent. I bid you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers for bringing such important messages to us. Now I would like to re-invite Go Ballet dancers to the front for their performance of Unspoken. 请欣赏 Go Ballet 舞团表演无言。
I'd like to re-invite Go Ballet dancers to the front to perform Unspoken.
Thank you, Go Back. Incredible performance. Now, for those who are able, please stand for the singing of the Canadian National Anthem. Pour conclure,
to conclude this ceremony, please stand to sing the national.
Please rise to sing the Canadian National Anthem.
thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please remain standing for the departure of the platform party. Mesdames et messieurs, merci beaucoup. Veuillez rester debout pour le départ du cortège de la tribune officielle.
Please join us in the Senate foyer for the reception. Our commemoration is now ended.